Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 4, Sensation and Perception, Part 2, The Other Senses. So, aside from sight and hearing, which we've already heard about, we're going to talk about things like body position and movement and our awareness of that, our sense of smell, taste, and our skin senses, focusing probably more on the sensation of pain. So, here we go. We're going to kind of look at the position and movement issues of the body. And we have to talk about two different senses that actually incorporate some different things. They kind of rely a little bit, this first one, on hearing and obviously touch, and that is the vestibular sense. The vestibular sense is the sense of body orientation with respect to gravity. And it really is associated primarily with the inner ear. So I want to take a look at this diagram here. We had previously talked a little bit about hearing, and we kind of glossed over the area of the inner ear called the semicircular canals. And it's really this part of the inner ear that has a tendency to help us with things like balance and equilibrium and such. So the semicircular canals and the vestibule, which is actually this area right here. The semicircular canals are kind of what looks like these little loops, okay? We have one that's, kind of going more horizontal, one that's going more vertical, one that's kind of to the side. And it's the fluid that's inside of this part of the inner ear that has a tendency to help us with balance and equilibrium. So these fluid-filled canals, what they do is when we move, the fluid inside of there shifts as well. And there are little nerve hairs, tiny hairs that are located inside of that canal that every time that fluid moves, it's triggering some kind of neural message that kind of helps us with our orientation of our balance. And if we would have like an inner ear infection, it might be possible that those canals and the hairs might be not necessarily sending the appropriate signal, and hence we might feel dizzy or disorientated. All right. Aside from the vestibular sense, we have the kinesthetic sense, and that is the sense of body position and movement of the body parts relative to each other. So when we're picking up our cell phone, how do we know which hand it actually is in? It is this kinesthetic sense, which kind of works a little bit with our sense of touch, that kind of tells us where this is at. It might also help us, after we've been sitting for a while, know which leg we have crossed over another. So, in a way, it is important, kind of keeps us understanding where we're at, and it keeps us from maybe looking kind of clumsy. All right, our sense of smell. Sometimes this is known as olfaction. And for the most part, our sense of smell, and eventually as we talk about the sense of taste, are really all kind of a chain of biochemical events. So the sense of smell is activated the following way. When odors interact with the receptor protein associated with the specialized hairs in the nose. Sometimes we call that protein odorant binding protein. It happens to kind of be probably molecular size type of protein, but there's lots of these that are inside of our nostrils. They say that there are roughly 5 million or more receptor cells, sometimes known as the olfactory receptor cells, that contain these hair cells that respond to stimulus. So like when we smell, for the most part, something good, like like maybe cookies baking, or if we smell something bad, like the smell of sulfur, that information is going to be eventually conveyed. And it's not conveyed necessarily to the brain, it's actually conveyed to the olfactory bulb, which is kind of on the underside of the brain. This is one of those weird senses that, for the most part, does not get processed through the thalamus. for the most part, it goes almost directly to the bulb, and that is where we make that decision about what that sense of smell is. So to kind of show this a little bit closer here, um, our sense of smell, in comparison to our previous senses of sight and hearing, is really less acute. It's not very good. Unlike maybe the sense of smell in a lot of other mammals, ours really is not well developed. Odor molecules and olfactory receptor cells act a lot like neurotransmitters on their receptor sites. So, if you can recall back when we talked about how neurotransmitters work when they go across the synapse and they kind of click in like a Lego, um, there are certain molecules, odor molecules, that have a particular shape that click in onto the receptor sites. So it's kind of a unique sense of sense, because it does have that tendency to kind of mirror what we were talking about with the neurotransmitters. And really, that's been kind of a theory that we've only known about for really the last maybe 20 years or so. Our sense of smell, for the most part, peaks in our early adulthood. And women have a tendency to have a little bit of an edge when it comes to sensitivities to smell compared to men. There's a lot of research that goes into talking about how, like, mothers can identify their baby infants by just the sense of smell alone. But as we get older, our sense of smell has a tendency to diminish. And unfortunately, as we get older, we have a harder time distinguishing certain smells. Humans, compared to other mammals, I mentioned a moment ago, have less receptor cells, and hence we're not um, really as good at detecting different senses of smell. But if you look at like animals like a bloodhound, a dog, they have really 2 million receptor cells, where we as humans only have 10 to 20 million. So they have a tendency to be able to identify a lot of different things just by that sense of smell. They might lack it in other senses as far as hearing or maybe even sight, but they can pick that up with the nose itself. In humans, there's a lot of evidence that our sense of smell is also connected back to the limbic system. Um, for some reason, we have a memory um, for smells, particularly smells that have a strong emotional component. So if we're, really frightened, we have a tendency to remember maybe the smells, like the smell of something burning. Or if we had a really pleasant memory, we might remember the smell of that. So needless to say, that's kind of a unique thing about humans, is that sensitivity and emotional link back to the sense of smell. I mentioned animals a little bit ago. There's the issue of pheromones, especially when we talk about other mammals. But this is the chemical signals that are released by organisms to communicate with members of other species. So if we were talking about like cats and dogs and maybe even deer, they have a tendency to use those pheromones to mark territory. And animals obviously are attracted to that, or they get really upset by that. All right, we're going to move on to our sense of taste. The sense of taste is sometimes known as gustation. This is the action of tasting. It works a lot like our sense of smell, and it does work in conjunction with that because it is a chemical nature. A lot of times, if you have a sinus infection or a stuffed up nose, your sense of taste is diminished because of the fact that you can't smell certain things. And when we talk about the receptors for taste, a lot of times we focus on the taste bud, and inside of that taste bud is the papilla, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. But there are a handful of tastes that are kind of linked together. The sensation of sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and probably the newer one known as umami, which is associated with MSG, which is monosodium glutamate. And it's the kind of a seasoning that you might find in Asian foods or the savoriness of meat and cheeses and seafood. Some people have a sensitivity to MSG, might cause them to have nausea or headaches or such if they eat a large quantity of that. So, our sense of taste does have a survival link. Um, Things that are typically sweeter are kind of like seen as an energy source, and we do show a preference for that at a very young age. Salty, for the most part, we do need sodium. It's kind of a physiological thing. Sour, there's that potential of something being kind of a toxic acid. So it's kind of a safety issue as far as, how much of that we take in. Bitter, there's a tendency for things that are bitter to have a link back to poisons. Granted, there are certain foods that are a little more prone to being bitter, such as coffee or maybe certain vegetables like broccoli. Umami is a protein, and it has a tendency to help grow and repair tissues. So some people might be a little more prone to liking the taste of that. So looking at the diagram kind of up here in the upper right corner, we have some examples of our taste buds, and these are located throughout our tongue. And certainly there are certain taste buds that obviously cluster in a certain way that have certain sensitivities. So when we look at like the papilla that are on our tongue, there are certain clusters that are probably more prone or sensitive to things that are sweet, salty, sour, bitter, or to umami. Okay. Yeah, the papilla, and for the most part, the taste bud itself, this is the receptor site, and it does have a tendency to kind of work like a hair cell, like we've talked about in other parts of the body. The food that we eat has a tendency to linger here. That's the reason why when you go to see your dentist, they obviously want you to brush your tongue to clean that off. But it also allows us to have that sensation of taste after we have tasted or eaten something. All right. There are some individuals that have acute sensitivities when we talk about taste, and that's where we'll get into talking about the person who might be the super taster. This is a person that has more taste buds that are sensitive to bitter foods. And as a result of that, they might dislike bitter foods like broccoli, diet sodas, and coffee. The thing of it is as we get older, it's possible that a person who might have had those sensitivities might find that as they age, they might diminish, and they might not necessarily have a problem with diet soft drinks or coffee as they get older. All right, we're going to talk about our last area here, and that's getting into our skin senses. This is the sensory system for processing touch, warmth, cold, texture, and pain. It's all connected to the somatosensory cortex, which is kind of the frontal part of the parietal lobe. And before we go any further, and I don't have this written down, but we have to talk about the receptor cells, the sensory receptors that are kind of more prone to things like hurtful temperatures, pressure, or chemicals, and that are nociceptors. These are the receptor cells that we're going to probably focus a little bit on as we go along here. So pain in general is kind of the one sensation of touch that really dominates all the other senses. About a third of Americans have persistent pain. Pain can be a part of our body's adaptive mechanism that makes us respond to conditions that are threatening. There are those rare cases where we have individuals that really don't have a lot of these pain receptors, the nociceptors, and they might not realize that they are in pain when they have been injured, which is not a good thing. So one of the weird theories that kind of goes along with pain is this theory known as the gate control theory. And it is an explanation for pain control that processes that we have a neural gate that can block incoming pain signals. And I kind of want to explain how this all works. Within the spinal cord, we have small, or sometimes known as the slow nerve fibers, and then we have large, sometimes known as the fast nerve fibers. And when we look at the slow fibers or the small fibers. These are the ones that have a tendency to produce pain. And according to this theory of the gate control theory, is that when we do sense pain, there is a gate in the spinal cord that opens up. Okay, and it opens up so it can send a signal to the brain telling us that we're hurt. We also have these large nerve fibers, sometimes known as the fast fibers, and their job is occasionally to close or block the gate. And the idea is there are things that we can do, that can block that pain. So imagine that you hit your thumb with a hammer. Probably the automatic response would be to take your thumb once it's been hit and to shake it. And the idea is that by vigorously shaking your thumb, that you kind of block the pain that's coming from that. And that's kind of how this works. Today, when we talk about like medicine, it might some people might deal with pain by doing things like electrical stimulants. They might go in and have a massage, where that area hurts, or even in some cases using acupuncture. And these different things are actually going to work as a way to block the pain. It's crazy enough. Okay. Along with that, we have to talk about the placebo effect. This is the response to a placebo caused by the subject's belief that they're really taking a drug. So there could be like a psychosomatic side to pain. If you think that you're taking an aspirin or some kind of pain medication, that you might actually release your own endorphins to help you deal with the pain, opposed to using drugs that basically are, kind of mimicking the use of endorphins like opiates. All right, pain tolerance. That is the threshold for pain, and it does vary from person to person. There are some people that are incredibly sensitive to pain, and I mean, they could get a scratch and it's like the end of their life. And then you have other people that obviously have a very high tolerance for that. Needless to say, all this sensitivity is activated through the thalamus, and it's the thalamus's job to process it. And some people obviously process it more often than others. Thank you very much.